Well, amen. God bless you so much, Dan. I'm sure many of you have met Dan, but they joined it back in January or so. Dan and Tammy Carr, we're so grateful for having y'all here. And you know, the gospel is a powerful thing when a Kansas and an Auburn fan can serve together on one stage, right? So we, because of the nature of our sermon today, we are going to be doing things a little differently. Christy's going to be taking all children 4 years old through first grade. They're going to be in the youth room. Children second grade through sixth grade are going to go with Hillary downstairs. So second through sixth with Hillary downstairs. 4 years old through first grade are up here. And we do ask if your child is old enough to comprehend what's being talked about that they go to one of those places. Now, I will say, I mentioned to Dan this morning, it's telling in regards to where both basketball programs are that Auburn is a 5 seed, and making it to the Sweet 16 is the greatest day in the life of Auburn basketball, whereas Kansas, being a number 4 seed, losing in the second round is like the most forgettable year in the last 30 years. So that's why, like I say with y'all, I've got to brag while I can, which is going to come next Sunday after we play y'all in the Elite Eight. And I've mentioned numerous times before about the possibility of wearing an orange suit. If that happens, there's a good chance I'll have an orange suit, and maybe a good chance I'll be looking for another job too. So, but if you haven't figured it out yet, the topic of our sermon today, I'm just going to go on and say the word to get it out there, to get the weirdness out. It's about sex. And so I wanted to kind of, I guess, start in the first place and just ask y'all honestly, by a show of hands, how many of y'all have ever heard a sermon specifically on this topic? Now, not in regards to don't have sex until you're married, or on the topic of, only have sex within your marriage. Has anybody ever heard a sermon, not a small group, but a sermon on what the Bible teaches about sex other than don't have it outside of marriage? Has anybody ever heard that before? All right, I didn't think so. I have taught this material or material similar to this 2 different times in small groups, 2 young adults. And I've asked that question, and I have yet to have a hand be raised. And folks, that's really not a good thing. And, I have not necessarily been looking forward to this sermon. I've known it's coming ever since I started my sermon series on marriage. Sex is kind of a big thing within marriage. And so if I'm going to be preaching an exhaustive sermon series on marriage, I kind of can't preach a series without this, so I knew it was coming. Of course, all this week I knew it was coming. Haven't necessarily been looking forward to it. But guys, it's necessary because we need to know what the Bible says. Because throughout the world, everywhere else we're hearing about it, it's nonsense. The world is just throwing nonsense at us about this topic. And we as Christians, we as single people, we as married couples, we need to be able to filter this nonsense that's being thrown at us through a biblical grid. Maybe some of you today are thinking, well, James, look, I understand what you're saying, but this is just so awkward. This is weird. And on top of that, I came to church today with my grandma, and, that just makes this even more weird. Look, it's Sunday morning in front of everybody. Shouldn't this be something that's in a small group somewhere, in a corner, with other men? And, why up here? Why Sunday? What are you doing? Pastor, we shouldn't be talking about sex from the pulpit on Sunday mornings. Pastor, this is so inappropriate. My response to that would be, you're wrong. You're very wrong. Of all places that sex can be talked about, and folks, especially with teenagers being in here today, I'm going to do my absolute best to make this sermon modest and to make it age appropriate. But of all places that this topic can be discussed and talked about, this is the place to where it needs to happen. It needs to be talked about in the context of the gospel. It needs to be talked about from the understanding of God. It needs to be talked about in the context and with God's family. And some of you, I'm sure, grew up in a family to where this was not talked about. And if that's true, that's not good. It should have been talked about within your home. And we need to make sure that that does not take place within God's family to where God's family turns out the same way, never talking about it and therefore never knowing what God says about it. God's family, with God as the Father, must talk about what God talks about. And as much as we may not want to talk about it, the Bible is very loud and clear. Our passage today in 1 Corinthians 7 could not be more blunt. Okay? The book Song of Solomon is so steamy on this matter. The Jews in the Old Testament wouldn't let children read it until they were 12. Okay? This is not a topic that God is silent on, and we as God's people must understand that. We must take this topic that so consumes so much of life, and we must learn about it in light of the gospel. Because here's the thing, guys, the world is talking about it, right? It's being talked about everywhere. In TV shows, in movies, in commercials for bathroom cleaners, right? They've turned Mr. Clean into a sex commercial. It is everywhere. It is being talked about at school. Pastor, 7th grade's kind of young to have in here. Guys, they're hearing it at school. It's being talked about at school. It's on their phones, it's on the computers, it's on the TVs, it's everywhere we look. And the world, and outside of these walls, they've got it all wrong. They've grossly twisted something that is beautiful and precious. Okay? And outside of these walls, again, they've got it wrong. It is only within this context that we find what is correct. Meanwhile, the church for ages and generations has been silent. Why? Because it's awkward. Because it's weird. Because it's private. Or when we do talk about it, listen to this, think about this. When we do talk about it, all we talk about is how the world has got it wrong. Right? No. Don't put that in that TV show. No, don't turn Mr. Clean into a sexual ad. No, don't do this. Don't do this. No. That's the only thing we talk about. It is no and don't. And what happens as we do that is that it comes off to the world, and probably even some within the church, that the church is against sex. Because all we ever hear is no. No, don't do that until you're married. No, don't do that outside of marriage. No, don't talk about that. No, that's wrong. No. But guys, the church is not against sex. God is not against sex. The Bible is not against sex. What we're against is we're against the distortion of sex. And at some point, the church is going to have to step up and start speaking. And not only speaking about what the world has wrong, but we've got to begin to speak about what the Bible says is right. We must be the ones teaching our children. We must be the one teaching our teenagers, because listen up, they are going to learn. Why not have them learn from us in church with God's family? See, folks, sex is a beautiful thing. Sex is created by God, but just like anything else, it has to be enjoyed in its proper context, in the guidelines that God gave it. If not, just like in the world, it will be distorted into something gross and sinful, but done right, it's beautiful, and we need to teach that. Doris, is my mic still on, or did it go off? Okay, good. Okay, so I was kind of loud. I noticed Doris didn't want to hear it today. He was one of the ones who considered not coming. So, just wanted to make sure I was still on. Thank you. All right, so the church has stayed silent on this for too long, and let the world yell it from the mountaintops. Well, again, guys, God was not silent on it, so why are we? As a result of the church being silent for too long, husbands and wives have grown up with a view of sex that has been primarily defined by the world. And this has led regularly to couples being unhappy and experiencing a great deal of conflict within that area of their marriage. Many, from the time that they're in middle school, get an idea in their minds of what they are expecting. And from the teenage years all the way up through marriage, they have a wrong view. And so they carry this view then into marriage. And from the outset of marriage, that wrong view then breeds complications that continue to compound year after year after year. So 1 Corinthians 7 is going to be our main passage of Scripture today, chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. You can turn there with me so that you can see and understand that I'm not making this up. The Bible is very clear on this. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Paul's right there. What's going on here? Throughout this book, this letter that's written to the church at Corinth, clearly the church at Corinth had a lot of questions about the Christian life. Because the church at Corinth was one of the most wicked cities there were. And so people were being saved out of vile sin and vile wickedness. If you read chapter 5, there was even vile sexual immorality taking place within the church. And so there's lots of questions. And in this letter, Paul is clearly addressing these questions that the church has. And here, it has been said to the church, the church has been said, and so people are asking about this. The church has said that it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Why? Because in that time period, just like now, when something gets distorted, we tend to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Corinth was a seedbed of sexual immorality, vile wickedness taking place. And so what the church did is, instead of teaching the proper view, they just threw all of it out and said, let's just nobody have sex, nobody get married, nobody have sex, let's get rid of it. And Paul is addressing that. And he moves on in verse 2. He says, but, remember, they said it's good to not have sex. Verse 2, he says, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. Okay? So sex is good. It should be taking place within marriage. It has a purpose, which we'll talk about later. Verse 3, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal right. Some translations say the affection she is due. And likewise, the wife to her husband. Notice in all of this, it's going to be reciprocal. He's not just focusing on husbands. He's not just focusing on wives. Everything is reciprocal. Verse 4, for the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Oh boy, right there, some women may be saying, here we go again with all this authority and submission stuff. We've been hearing this for months now about this authority and submission stuff, and now we get into sex, and he has authority over my body? Not necessarily, because listen, it's reciprocal. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Okay? It is mutual submission within the marriage relationship. Verse 5, I have a feeling that this probably does not characterize anybody in here. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. In all my years of being a pastor, I've never had anybody come to me and say, Pastor, sex is so wonderful in our marriage, we have decided to take a break and pray and fast instead of having sex. At no point has anybody ever said that to me. If anything, it's the exact opposite, right? So here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, guys, the Bible's clear on this. This isn't some hidden message. This isn't some mystery. This isn't some mixed message. Paul is very clear. And so today I've got 3 biblical principles about sex. And guys, this is for everybody, okay? Because these principles apply more towards sexual desires necessarily than sex itself. So point number 1 is this: sex is not about your own pleasure. Sex is not about your own pleasure. And throughout this week, and really these last 2 months, as I've been trying to figure out who to allow to be in here and who not, and I couldn't decide, should I make it high schoolers and up? Should I just go, take the high schools, the youth out and let it just be adults? This right here, this point is the reason I said I want 7th graders through 12th graders in here as well, because this needs to be known and understood from the beginning. Sex is not about your own pleasure. And for those youth in here today, again, this is the main reason I wanted you in here. This is what you need to know. And if you come away with anything today, I hope it's this. It's this. And you take this with you throughout your life until you get married and after you get married. So, if sex is not about my pleasure, then what is it about? It's about 2 things. First, it's about the gospel. It's about the gospel. And really, we go back to, throughout this whole sermon series, what's the purpose of marriage? Well, generally, the purpose of marriage is the glory of God. 1 Corinthians 10:31, whatever you do, whether you eat or drink, said last week, or resolve conflict or have sex, you do for the glory of God. Ephesians 5:32, this mystery is profound. As he's talking about marriage, this mystery is profound. And I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. We've talked about that, how marriage is a picture of the gospel to the world. But more specifically, marriage is about companionship. We'll get back to that companionship in a second. But right now, first, we look at for the glory of God. For the glory of God. And so, what's one of the first purposes of sex? It's this: holiness. Holiness. Look with me back at chapter 2. Remember, they had said not chapter 2, verse 2. Remember, they had said in verse 1, it's good not to have sex. Paul says, no, it's good to have sex. Why? Because of the temptation to sexual immorality. And then we look down in verse 5. He says, don't deprive one another. Rather, you should be having regular relations unless you decide to stop having regular relations for the purpose of fasting and praying. But don't go too long in that, or if not, you will become tempted. And so one of the first purposes is holiness. We look at verses 8 and 9 of chapter 7. To the unmarried and the widows I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am, but if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than burn with passion. So our first line of defense against sexual temptation and immorality is marriage. And within that marriage, it's the sexual relationship. And this is one, not all, believe me, not all. This is one of the reasons that I believe that immorality is on the rise, even among Christians, because the age of marriage is likewise on the rise. People used to get married as teenagers, 19, 20. Hillary got married at 20. I was 23. And, everybody would have thought that she slapped her mom and dishonored her mom for getting married so early at 20. 50 years ago, she would have been old getting married at 20. Now you're seeing the age of marriage creeping up closer to 30. And yet we have biblical command here that to help with sexual temptation, get married. Today we're taking forever to get married, and then we get engaged, and we stay engaged for a year, year and a half, 2 years. All the while we are burning with passion for that person that we are in love with. And why is it that we are taking so long to get married? Here's a lot of it. It's not the children, it's you parents. Why? Because you need to be done with college and be financially secure. Right? That is the number one reason I hear about people who are in love and want to get married while in college, while they are told to wait. You need to be financially secure. And what's happened is we have elevated financial security above purity. Our main desire for our children should be purity. And sometimes to have that, they need marriage. Okay? But, again, I'm not saying just let your child make dumb decisions and get married to whoever they want and whenever they want. Nope. Hopefully, throughout that child's life and even within that relationship, the parent and the child are working together, discerning if this is a wise relationship, a relationship that should one day end in marriage. And if it is, then let them go on and get married. Teach them and train them and help them through those early years. Guys, in your first 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 15 years, you were stupid too, okay? Your children are going to make mistakes. They're going to make dumb financial decisions. They're going to make just dumb decisions in general. Because they're young, they don't know what they're doing. You did it too. Be there as wise counsel and help them, but don't forbid them. The Bible says if you found somebody good to marry and you are burning with passion, then get married. So the first purpose of sex has the gospel and the glory of God on your mind. We want to be holy as God is holy, okay? We don't want to burn with immorality and fall into immorality. And God gives us marriage and the sexual relationship to help us in that endeavor. So first, I guess we see it's not about our own pleasure. It's about the gospel. Second, it's not about your own pleasure. It's about your spouse. It's about your spouse. Now, how has God designed for you to receive that help as you burn with passion and desire? By taking sex yourself? Nope, that's not the answer. It's by you having a spouse that will put your needs first and your desires above their own. Look with me at verses 3 and 4. Once again, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights. And I want to emphasize there the word rights, okay? It's not a suggestion. It is a right that your spouse has. Some translations say the affection that is due them. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. So because sex is a means of holiness and also a means of companionship, sex, or maybe a better phrase for it, would be affection, because sex is just a category of affection. People feel affection in more ways than just that one way. Affection is a right that is due them. They have a right to have those desires met, and whose job is it to meet? Again, we look down to verse 4. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. So the husband does not have authority over his own body to meet his own sexual desires. Likewise, the wife, with affections and desires that she craves, she does not have authority over her own body to meet her own desires. Rather, it's the husband's job to meet the wife's desires. Likewise, reciprocal, the wife's job to meet the husband's desire. There already today might, again, be women in here saying, well, oh great, here we go with this. I've just got to do whatever he says. But no, this has nothing to do with male headship. Again, these verses are reciprocal. Just as the husband has authority over your body, so too do you have authority over his. And others might say, well, hold on, Pastor, I'm not okay with that. I'm not okay with my spouse just having rights to my body that he can get and he can use whenever he wants. But I want to stop you and make you think about this. So far, no one has said anything about getting, right? The word getting has not been used. You don't have authority over your spouse's body for you to get or receive whenever you want. You have the authority to give. 1 Corinthians 7, 3 through 5 does not state that we stake claim to the other's bodies for our own gratification. That is not what their bodies are there for. It says that we commit to using our bodies for their gratification. Paul in here does not say, take your rights. Rather, he says, give her her rights. He says, give him his rights. Do not refuse one another. All right? The authority is not over, I get it whenever I want. The authority over it is, you don't have the right to meet your own desire. That's my authority. Therefore, I will give myself for that purpose. Again, this goes back to verse 2. where he says to get married to help with sexual desire. In light of that desire, give your body to your spouse. It is your job to bring pleasure and affection. And listen up, men. That affection is however that pleasure and affection is desired. I think Paul does have in mind here the sexual relationship, but again, affection might not just be in the bedroom. People, and in particular women, feel affection in many different ways. And husbands, it is your job, and likewise this is reciprocal towards the wife too, to meet that affection however it might be. We don't just go home and say, all right, you heard Brother James. Nope, your job is to meet her needs, whatever those needs are. Which might be snuggling on the couch, or under the covers as you go to sleep, or vacuuming, or doing the dishes, or giving the children baths. You might find your wife a whole lot more open if you started doing stuff like that. Your job is to show affection, whatever that affection is. And so as opposed to this idea of authority leading to possible abuse, rather Christians should be having the most pleasing sex, the most freeing sex, the most satisfying sex, because both are focused on the pleasure of others instead of using the other for their own pleasure. And this is the opposite of the way that most think. Most think that Christian sex is restrictive and boring. It is restrictive, true, but with those restrictions, there is more freedom than anyone has outside of those restrictions, because within the relationship, as you are thinking about giving, the joy is limitless. Whereas when it's backwards, all I'm thinking about is he or she doing what I actually want them to do. See, folks, when you stood at the altar and said, I do, you may not have known it at the time, but you were giving up the title deed to your body. Again, you may not have realized that's what the words I do meant, but that's what happened. But here's what's happened within marriage. 1 Corinthians 7:5 again says the only time that there should be an extended time off from relations is when you decide that you as a couple need to fast and pray for the good of your spiritual lives. Other than that, it's regular. But for so many couples, it's not. Now think about this. Before marriage, the command is don't have sex, right? Yet, what is the temptation before marriage? When you're in your dating relationship, what's the temptation? Command, don't have sex. Temptation, do have sex, right? Right? When you get married, the command is be having regular sex to the point that the only reason you stop is to fast and pray. Yet, what is the temptation in marriage? Don't have sex, right? It's flip-flop. Before marriage, don't have sex. Temptation, do have sex. After marriage, do have sex. Temptation, don't have sex. It's flip-flopped, right? We have these desires within us, and we fight these temptations throughout the day. All right? Men go to work, and everywhere they turn, they're tempted. It's on the computer, and they have to fight that urge. It's on their phone, and they fight that urge. There's scantily clad women at their work, scantily clad women at the store, walking down the road, on TV. Everywhere they look, the waitresses they go to at the restaurant, everywhere they look, and they're fighting it, wanting to be faithful to the Lord, wanting to be faithful to their wife. And then they come home with their desires burning to the place where they should be able to indulge, and what do they hear? I'm too tired. I'm still angry about yesterday. I've had a long day. Kids are driving me crazy. I'm frustrated. And it's like, come on. All day I've been fighting it. And here in the marriage, in the context, is the one place I'm supposed to be able to indulge. And it's the one place in all the world that is shut off. It's like if someone gave you the title deed to their beach condo, and boy, you're excited. I'm going to be at the beach every weekend this year. I'm so excited. And then every time you want to go, you call and they say, yeah, I realize you got the title deed, but it's not open. You can't go. Well, what was the purpose in getting the title to it anyways if I can't ever go? In life, we have these desires, and if we can't control these desires, we find someone who fits the biblical qualifications, and for the glory of God, we marry them. And God says that the spouse has the obligation to feel and to meet those desires. Because a person doesn't have the right to fulfill their desires in and of themselves. Those desires are met via the spouse. Now, there may be some people in here, probably wives, may be terrified right now. So hold on, I'm just supposed to, whenever the husband wants? Look, think about it this way. This isn't something to be scared of. Think about it this way. Again, the focus for both husband and wife is each other in meeting those needs. It's not about yourself, okay? That's point number one. It's not about yourself. It's about your spouse. So let's say, hypothetically speaking, there's different desires. And hypothetically speaking, it's the husband's desire who's up here, and hypothetically speaking, the wife's desire is down here. And the wife's be thinking, oh boy, I shouldn't have come today, all right? And, but what happens when we apply this to our marriage, the husband says, I'm desiring it, but man, my wife is tired. My wife has been with the kids all day. My wife, she's worked just as long and hard as I have, whether it's at home or whether it's at work. She's sick. She's not feeling good. My wife probably wants affection in some other way than this. And so as I begin to get excited about meeting the needs of my wife, my desire for sex, watch this, comes down. That wife who's tired, doesn't feel like it understands the needs of her husband, the desires of her husband. And yeah, she's tired. She may be worn out. She may not want to. But as she begins to get excited about pleasing the Lord by meeting the needs of her spouse, her desire for it begins to go up. All right? And his started out up here. Hers never got up there. But as his desire to meet hers in other ways goes up, his desire for sex goes down. Hers go up, and they're about right there in the middle. Okay? They're like this in your marriage now because neither one of you are thinking about the other one. Both of you are thinking about yourself. God has not commanded you to do something in His Word that He has not then equipped you to do. You see, when we become teenagers, we begin to have these desires. And everywhere you look on TV and the movies, the focus is always finding someone so that I can have these desires fulfilled within me. People in school, friends, seeking relationships for the same thing. And what has happened in our society is that we have made an idol out of pleasure. We begin to bow down at the altar of my pleasure. God has given us something good and something beautiful, something that is only meant to be satisfied within the bounds of marriage, and something that is meant to be others-focused, and we have twisted it and bowed down and worshipped it. We've said even from our teenage years, I've got to have this, and we grow up dreaming about it. We can't wait till the honeymoon. We can't wait because then all my problems are going to be solved and life is going to be so wonderful, and on and on and on. I've got to have this. Husbands are mad and angry because they're not getting it as much as they want. Wives are mad because that's all their husbands want, and that's all we think about. And we've turned something that God created as a way of serving your spouse and turned it inward again so that I spend my pre-married life dreaming of it and craving it. I spend my married life mad at my spouse for desiring it too much or desiring it too less. And at no point in all of this is the focus ever on God and the gospel and my spouse. Rather, we say, but that's not my nature. I'm tired. I'm not in the mood. I don't feel like it. It's all me. Now, many of you may remember from the 90s, the True Love Waits movement, which I went through as a youth. So many churches did. Some of you went through that. That's where the purity rings came from. And now True Love Waits brought a lot of good. I'm not here to say it's bad. Churches shouldn't have done it. You shouldn't have gone through it. But it's come out now that all those teenagers who went through it, now that they're adults and they're married, some problems with it have come out. It's good in the sense that it taught you the importance of waiting. But here's what it taught. It never taught you how to use your desires the right way. It said if you really love, then you'll wait to have your desires fulfilled. And so, you're a 7th grade boy going through True Love Waits. Oh, okay, all these desires. If I really love God and I really love my wife, I'm going to wait. Then I'm going to have all these desires fulfilled. And you get there on your honeymoon night, and that 10 years of waiting wasn't worth it. Because True Love Waits said, you wait and then you'll get all your desires fulfilled. And it never taught that those desires are to be redirected out of yourself and onto God and to your spouse. Point number 2. Sex is an overflow of the rest of your relationship, not your relationship itself. Sex is an overflow of the rest of your relationship, not your relationship itself. And this is why conflict resolution was the sermon before the sermon on sex, because in general, conflict resolution comes before sex. I mean, very rarely have I ever met, in particular, a woman who is fuming at her husband, angry at the stupid things that he's done, and then has said, hey, you know what, I've got a good idea, let's go have sex. The husband would be like, absolutely, sounds good to me. But the wife, no, that doesn't happen. For the most part, sex is an overflow of what's going on within the marriage. John Piper says this in his book, This Momentary Marriage. He says, the hard, rugged work of forgiving and forbearing is what makes it possible for affections to flourish when they seem to have died. See, sex is rarely the root problem in a marriage and almost always the first casualty when a marriage begins to erode. The absence of sex in a marriage is an indicator that things are not right in your relationship. This is because sex is others focused. And in general, when there's conflict in a marriage that's not being resolved, that seed, I've talked about the last 2 weeks, that seed of offense, that seed of hurt has been buried into the soil of your marriage, and it's rooted into bitterness and grown into a big tree, and all you are thinking about is how I've been offended, I've been hurt. The essence of conflict is that you are focused on yourself. And if you are focused on yourself, at no point then are you going to be focused on your spouse, which is from where a biblical sexual relationship flows. So, and I want to add to this as well, is because you getting your sexual desires fulfilled is not the focus, but rather you meeting the needs of your spouse is the focus. Sex then is not the basis of marriage. A good marriage is not dependent on good sex. Think about this. What happens when one spouse becomes incapacitated? Hillary's grandparents, who have both now passed, I have probably learned more about marriage from watching them than any book I've ever read, any sermon I've heard, any professor I have sat under. Hillary's grandmother was homebound in a bed in their living room for the last 8 years of their marriage, yet both of them were probably the two most joyful people that I've ever met. Her grandfather served her hand and foot 24 hours a day for 8 years. Again, the most joyful, the most encouraging, the most wonderful man that I've ever met. And he served her with joy, he served her with love, and everybody who knew them knew the affection that they had towards one another. And I've thought about this before. In all those years of her being homebound, she couldn't even sit up in bed anymore. When Elijah was born, me and Hillary's grandfather had to physically hold her up, and Hillary held Elijah in her arms so that she could hold him. And I've thought about this. There's no way physically possible for them to have sex the entire last 8 years of their marriage. Yet, the most joyful and most affectionate couple that I've ever met. And it's because their marriage was rooted in taking joy first in the gospel, but taking joy in each other. And it was in meeting the needs of each other. And at some point, life happens, and you can't fulfill those desires anymore. But if your marriage has been rooted and grounded upon something more than sex, then that marriage can last even when sex doesn't. Point number 3, sex is a beautiful thing and is shaped and defined by the gospel. Sex is a beautiful thing and is shaped and defined by the gospel. For too long, the only voice the church has had on the topic of sex is this: be a virgin when you get married, and then only have sex with your spouse. But the gospel call, listen to this, this may be shocking, but hold on. The gospel call is not a call to virginity. It's not a call to virginity. Stay with me. Virginity is good and something that should be strived for, but the gospel call is something more than that. The gospel call is a call to purity. Okay, teenagers, adults, one can be a virgin prior to marriage and still not be pure. Because purity flows from the heart. Purity is not the same as abstinence. In some ways, the church has held it up. All these sex ed classes, they don't need sex ed classes. They need abstinence education. Wrong. They need purity education. Okay? We don't want abstinence among our children. We want purity. We don't want only physical fidelity within our marriages. We want our spouses to be pure. And also, another reason why this point needs to be made, a big one, is that while virginity can be lost, purity can always be gained. Okay? People who lost their virginity, they don't have to live in grief and sorrow and guilt and shame. They don't have to carry that into their marriage. Because my goal was never virginity in the first place. My goal was purity, and my purity is found in Jesus Christ. The gospel is what makes you new. The gospel changes you and washes away your sin. Ephesians 5 says that Christ sanctifies you, cleansing you with the washing of the water with the word, that he might present you to himself without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that you might be holy and blameless before him, regardless of what has happened in your past. Okay? When we come to Christ, Christ washes all of that away. And you are presented as holy and blameless, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing. And this was another failure of the True Love Waits movement. It didn't preach purity as much as it preached virginity. And then there would be young ladies that, out of dumb choices, would lose their virginity, and they would be crushed over it. And still to this day are living in guilt, thinking that I'm not properly loving my husband because I didn't wait. And yes, they should have waited. I'm not justifying what they did. They should have waited. But instead of that guilt, look, it's okay. God has washed that away. It is in Christ that you are pure. It's not in and of yourself. It is in Christ. Okay? You don't have to live in that guilt. You don't have to carry that guilt. Again, His grace is not a justification for sin. But guys, we want something more. More. And as we live our lives in this world, as we live our lives in our dating relationships, as we live our lives in our marriages, as we live our lives as single people, as we live our lives as teenagers just trying to figure this out, as we live our lives as adults who've been dealing with this for a long time, guys, the Bible says that sex is good. I want us to know that. I want us to understand it. I don't want the view from the church to be sex is bad. I want you to understand that it is good, but I want you to understand how to deal with it. First, those desires are directed to God and the gospel. I want to use these for God and the gospel. Secondly, I'm going to use them for God and the gospel by being a companion to my spouse and meeting their needs and giving them the rights that are due them. Okay? Secondly, I'm going to work on all of the other aspects of my marriage and deal with them, because the sexual relationship flows out of all of that. And one day this might be gone. So I've got to make sure that all of this is right. All of this other stuff, okay? That flows out of it. Work on this for that. And third, I'm going to let the gospel shape my view so that I'm seeking purity more than anything else. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.